Hello, Starfarers, and welcome back to the Tetra Galaxy Telecast. For today's transmission's topic, in dedication to you fair listeners for getting me to the 100 subscriber milestone, I will be beginning a new series on the channel where I go over each game in the Metroid franchise and rank every boss in the game. I'll be ranking each boss first, and after the rankings are done, I'll give ratings on a scale of 1 to 10, breaking each fight down to scores for individual categories and a total rating at the end. The rankings and ratings will be determined by a mix of my personal experience playing against them and which bosses I think are best designed from an impartial perspective. We'll be going in chronological order over the course of the series, like we always do here, so this episode will be dedicated to the one that started it all, 1986's Metroid. Not that it wouldn't have been the first one covered anyway, but you get the point. Expect Zero Mission next, not Return of Samus. Oh, and I'll be covering the North American versions of the games only, for consistency's sake. With no further delay, let's begin. The original title, which I'll refer to as Nestroid for the rest of the broadcast, has a mere 3 bosses, the lowest number of boss fights in any game to this day, those bosses being Kraid, Ridley, and Mother Brain. Of course, all 3 would go on to be iconic villains in the series, but it's the most iconic of them all, Ridley, that I'll have to give the last place spot. As iconic as he is, Ridley surprisingly comes from more than humble origins. Yeah, the extent of the cunning god of death's first fearsome duel as he jumps up and down and shoots fireballs slowly towards you. Not exactly the riveting battle of bitter nemesis you'd expect. The biggest problem with this boss fight is that Ridley only ever moves up and down, so he's never really attacking you, though at least it changes the trajectory of the fireballs. The room he's in also hurts the fight, as even if you're losing to him, his fireballs don't reach the end of the room, so you can sit back without worrying about the lava below. You can even shoot him from there if you freeze the fireballs or wait for them to disappear. The fact that he's 1 block above you also hurts the fight, because you could sneak under him and freeze the fireballs before they can hit you. His size is a saving grace, as he's small enough to where you have to deal with the fireballs before attacking him, but not too small where it becomes annoying to try and hit him. The size is good, but the movement makes Ridley a very passive boss, which is only made worse by the slowness of the fireballs, and that along with the room layout make it way too easy to fight him. These issues result in a boss fight that lacks urgency. I mean, Ridley's fireballs are his only attack, and they can be frozen with the ice beam, so if you freeze them, you could just spam missiles at him with little to no consequence for the duration of the match. How am I supposed to take this boss seriously? And because of that, there's no strategy to this fight either. You just freeze the fireballs, and Ridley jumps up and down and lets you kill him in a hilariously easy snooze fest of a fight. The mechanics are at least sound, but there isn't anything interesting going on here either, so I can't say they got that right either. The cherry on top is the slowdown, which can be a problem in Nestroid, but in this fight there's always a lot of projectiles on screen, and it's especially bad here. This fight doesn't even make up for the dismal gameplay with its other aspects. Like, the Parasite Queen in Prime is a pushover too, but at least she serves as a good tutorial boss, and is also a great spectacle with memorable music. Ridley and Nestroid, on the other hand, I mean, his sprite work and music are both okay, but those in and of themselves aren't amazing, and they definitely don't save the boss fight from its poor gameplay. And this is the boss you had to get through possibly the most grueling areas of the game to fight. What a waste. Overall, Ridley's Nestroid battle is about as bad of a boss fight as you'll find in this franchise, and given the lack of pretty much everything, really, let's just count ourselves lucky that Nintendo didn't look back to this as a blueprint for future Ridley boss fights and move on, shall we? Taking second place on this list would be the final boss herself, Mother Brain. The key element of this boss fight that jumps out is just how much there is going on here. Rinkas and turrets flood the screen, which forces the player to move constantly, and small platforms force the player to keep themselves in check as they avoid the many projectiles, still having to find a way to actually attack Mother Brain all the while. Mother Brain herself remains idle, but that actually makes the boss fight better, because it allows the philosophy of Nestroid's game design to shine. The world is not designed in your favor, and it's really the room itself you're fighting against. The room itself is designed greatly too, as the room is open with a lava pit on the left side, so you can't be overzealous approaching Mother Brain, but more importantly, the room remains open, so the projectiles don't just hit you, they, combined with a small platform, can set you back in the room, and through that, not only impeding, but undoing your progress. The size of the boss is perfect too, as her size relative to Ridley and Kraid signifies her importance and difficulty as the final boss, but the actual amount of room you have to shoot her is very small, forcing you to stay on the small platform next to her, where you're most vulnerable. Between the excellent design of the room, and the proper movement, or lack thereof, and the size of Mother Brain, along with the straightforward but tasking mechanics, this fight, in concept, has the makings of a great boss battle. Sadly, however, it falls way short of that in execution because of Nestroid's frustrating physics. The way that jumping works in this game, specifically the fact that Samus will stop spinning during a spin jump before she hits the ground, often ends up causing the player to get hit by a projectile they shouldn't have, which is only exacerbated by the fact that the room is long and relatively short, so most jumps are going to be low to the ground, and thus the screw attack won't be active for long anyway. The game also has problems with slowdown, since it was initially designed for the more powerful floppy disk system in Japan. This can be annoying normally, but the horde of projectiles causes it to lag out in Mother Brain's chamber at another level, and can mess up the player's timing when they're trying to jump from small platform to small platform. Rinkas can also often unfreeze because turning around and firing while in the air causes 2 shots to be fired for some reason, so the player will accidentally freeze and unfreeze Rinkas sometimes. Jumping out of the lava can be annoying too, as Samus' spin jump often activates when jumping out of the lava for no real reason, so even if the player freezes a Rinka to help them out, they might end up destroying it, again, through no fault of their own. There are also no missile recharge stations in Nestroid, and you can't kill anything in Turian with just the beam except Rinkas, which drop nothing. So if you run out of missiles, you either have to die or go all the way back out of Turian. Of course, dying in this game leaves you with as many missiles as you died with, so you'd still have 0, so the only real option is to leave Turian entirely and farm for missiles. This isn't even that unlikely, as the doors in Turian take 20 missiles altogether, the Zebatites take 8 missiles each for a total of 40, and Mother Brain takes 33 missiles to defeat, 1 to break the glass and 32 for Mother Brain herself, which ends up totaling 93 missiles, all assuming that the Zebatites don't regenerate at all, which probably will happen given the projectile's propensity for knocking players off the platforms. And that's all assuming you don't use a single missile on the Metroids or miss a single shot during the fight, which is extremely unlikely. So unless you walk into Turian with a hefty surplus of missiles, or if the Metroids generously drop missiles after you've killed them, which is luck-based, you have to exit the whole area and farm, then get all the way back to Mother Brain. Oh yeah, and if you leave the area or die, Mother Brain's health and the glass is restored, so that's another 33 missiles at least, and the fight begins again. Of course, if you do die, you spawn back in with 30 energy, and you are not defeating Mother Brain with 30 energy unless you're exceptionally skilled at the game, which means even more farming is required. I get that exploring is a big part of this game, but being turned away from the final boss because you had 120 missiles or something like that, and you lost all of them because the game's physics screwed you over and over again, is extremely frustrating, especially since it means you'll be farming, which with Nestroid's drop system is even worse than it normally is to farm in games. The list of issues the game presents in this boss fight was a bit long-winded, but I made sure it was presented that way to emphasize just how much this boss fight is weighed down not by design, but because of the game it's in. The markings of a great boss fight are here, but sadly, with the multitude of issues weighing the fight down, it, in execution, becomes a tedious and often very frustrating fight. Without Nestroid's general issues, this fight would be great, as there's nothing really bad about the fight itself, but it falls heavily thanks to the game's larger issues, and it stays at number 2. Having ranked the other 2 bosses, that of course leaves my number 1 boss fight in Nestroid as Kraid. There are a few reasons for why. Firstly, there are multiple ways to approach the fight. You could play more cautiously, freezing his projectiles and avoiding the ones you can't, while shooting him with missiles when the opportunity presents itself. You could take a more aggressive approach by shooting missiles continuously while not freezing any projectiles and simply trying to dodge all of them. Or you could go full throttle and just bomb Kraid to death, big bodying him by utilizing a lot of E-tanks, or some E-tanks in the Varia suit. The multiple ways to fight Kraid add a lot of nuance to it, and give it surprisingly great depth. Secondly, Kraid does something the other bosses don't do in this game, and it helps him out tremendously. He moves. It sounds stupidly simple, but Kraid moving horizontally back and forth adds a lot to the fight. His movement changes the trajectory of his overhead projectiles, the timing of his spike projectiles, and Kraid himself can approach you and also deal damage, so you have to watch out for him too. Thirdly, the projectiles I've mentioned here add a lot as well. There's a low projectile you can't freeze, so you have to jump over it or eat the damage. There's a middle spike that can easily be frozen, but freezing it on Kraid will make shooting Kraid harder, as it then acts as a sort of armor for him. The top spike can be frozen, but you have to jump to hit it, which leaves you vulnerable to the overhead projectiles, which are always changing trajectory, since Kraid keeps moving throughout the fight. And you've got to worry about all of that, and you have to account for Kraid approaching you all the while actually attacking him at the same time. Kraid's size also works in favor of his aggressiveness, with his approach being a more personal threat and his size not being too large where his projectiles become overspaced and unthreatening. The room also works well here, as the only way to attack Kraid is to get close to him, which forces you into danger that can only be staved off by leaving to the left. All three benefit Kraid in the fight, and work well together. This boss is aggressive, lively, and old school tough, which is everything it should be. The boss is so old school tough, in fact, that the fight actually proved too much for me to handle when I played the game for the first time, and proved to forge a distinct memory for me. I vividly remember the excitement I had those summers ago when I played the game for the first time, excited to beat this classic now that games like Super and Prime had made me a fan of the series. Finding and fighting my way through Zebus was a blast, but when I got to Kraid, I had no answers whatsoever for how to defeat him. Cautiously freeze projectiles and use missiles given the chance? Dead. Use missiles and dodge the projectiles? Dead. Bomb him to death and outlast him? You guessed it. Dead. Whatever I chose to do, nothing I did seemed to save me from getting mauled. I ultimately had to put the game down because of him. Fortunately, I finally came back to the game a month later, and when I did return, I felt a strange yet enthralling determination that doesn't come over me often, let alone for a video game, and unbeknownst to me, I was more than ready. Upon my triumphant return, I defeated Kraid on the first try, which was a huge surprise for me, because when I went in there, I was prepared to tally my deaths in scores. It was a thrilling moment when it happened, and has proven to be one of the memories of this series that's stuck with me throughout the years. I find Kraid to be a well-designed boss regardless of my own fights against him, but my personal experiences with the boss throughout my playthroughs, especially my first, only sweeten the deal. My positive experiences personally, and what I consider to be a well-designed and executed fight impartially speaking, have altogether resulted in Kraid being placed firmly in first place. It should also be mentioned that the game's physics actually help this fight surprisingly enough. The added pressure the bottom spike adds wouldn't be there if you could just aim down at it like you could if this was any other Metroid game. Kraid being Samus' size in this game also makes his attacks and movement more aggressive, with him being at your level. We know Kraid doesn't stay at your level for future entries. Spin jumping isn't really something you'll be doing here either, so the spin jump stopping short of the ground doesn't hurt here. The only frustrating thing the game does in this fight is it makes it nearly impossible to escape the acid if you fall in without the high jump boots, but first time players will tend to grab the high jump boots prior to fighting Kraid, so it's usually not an issue, but when it is, oh boy, I've got a few words to say. Now that the rankings are finished, I have to introduce you to the categories I'll be using for this series. All told, I'll be using 10 categories, with those categories being Concept, Design, as in the way the boss's size, movement, and the room it's in affect the fight. Design, as in the visual design of the boss, in-game, not in artwork. Mechanics, gameplay, spectacle, which includes its impact from a storytelling standpoint, the grandeur of the boss, and the atmosphere of the boss fight. Sound effects, music, reward, as in what you get for defeating the boss, and of course, the total rating. Also, because some categories are more important than others, and the whole doesn't always equal the sum of its parts, the total rating is not just the average of the other categories, so everything but gameplay could be a 10, the gameplay a 3, and the total rating could be a 6, for example. The parts will all be in whole number ratings, while the total rating will go to the first decimal point, or the 10th place. These ratings will be used across the series, and I'll be giving the bosses their ratings in order of the rankings, so for this broadcast, I'll be rating Ridley first, since he placed last. Ridley's ratings don't stack up very well, given how bad the boss fight is. Looking at each category, his scores are: Concept, 6. Fighting a space dragon sounds cool on paper, so the concept of the boss itself is pretty good, but nothing interesting is really being done with the boss fight itself, just point and shoot. Design, 3. Ridley's size is well suited for the fight, but both the lack of horizontal movement and the room layout make the fight substantially duller and easier than it should be. Visual design, 6. The sprite work is solid, the purple and green help it stand out in the room, and I do think that the horn is a nice touch here, but I've never been a fan of the stubby wings, the short tail, or whatever you want to call those messed up legs. Overall, it's alright. Thank goodness I'm just looking at the boss's in-game design, because oh god, what is that? Mechanics, 4. The mechanics of this fight are dreadfully boring. Just freeze, fire, and repeat at your leisure. The mechanics are inoffensive at least, since there's no janky hitboxes and everything works how it's supposed to, but they leave a lot to be desired. Gameplay, 2. The poor design and boring mechanics hurt the gameplay a lot, and fireballs are always on screen or being replaced, which causes the fight to suffer slowdown often. Ridley also dies pretty quickly, so a boss fight that's way too easy as is becomes even easier. Sound effects, 5. The sound effects are these sort of high-pitched, digitized chirping sounds. It's actually a pretty solid sound effect on its own, but hardly fitting for the cunning god of death. Music, 6. Ridley's theme is just the Turian theme, which actually works okay with the boss fight. It's low, tense, urgent, and works well enough, though Ridley has far better music in subsequent entries. Spectacle, 1. There's no proper build-up to the fight, Ridley is the same size as you, there's no dramatic music to uplift the fight, and the only catharsis I get from defeating Ridley is that I don't have to deal with the worst areas of the game anymore. Reward, 2. All you get is 75 missiles, which is better than nothing, I guess, but chances are you've got a lot of missiles by this point already, so it barely even matters. This is probably the lamest reward you get for defeating a boss in the whole series, but it is something. Total, 2.6. The idea of fighting a space dragon sounds cool, Ridley's visual design and the music are solid, and basically everything else in the fight sucks. Ridley is an unimpressive pushover in Metroid, and I'm glad they remedied that in future entries, because this was an extremely poor start for the cunning god of death. Mother Brain is the next boss on the list, and her ratings are: Concept, 8. A brain in a jar isn't up there with fighting a space dragon, but it sure is unique. The boss fight is where the concept shines, as the way the room is designed to impede and undo your progress towards your ultimate goal is a brilliant culmination of Metroid's game design and philosophy. Design, 8. The room is open and dangerous, and can easily push the player back. Along with the stationary nature of Mother Brain and the small attack window, it makes for a great boss fight, although it isn't particularly interesting or intricate, which is the reason it loses points. Visual design, 7. The colors don't pop, but don't really need to given Mother Brain's size. I like how Mother Brain's drooping flesh and the plethora of tubes connected to her, including the ones on the walls, make Mother Brain look weighted down, giving an aura of heaviness and immovability. The chunk in the center maintains the mechanical presence of Mother Brain well, and the horns are a nice flair. This is also possibly the best sprite work in the game. But the elephant-like tusk and front tube look silly, and Mother Brain lacks her signature singular eye and color scheme here, so this Mother Brain design isn't the best. Mechanics 6. The elements of dodging the turrets, freezing or dodging the Rinkas, and all the while worrying about tight platforming make a mechanically basic fight pretty engaging and demanding. Gameplay 3. The design and mechanics are great, but the extreme slowdown and laundry list of poor physics in Metroid hit this boss fight hard, dropping the score drastically. Sound effects 6. The sound effects are the same as Ridley's, but I think these shrill chirps fit Mother Brain better, well, with her mechanical design and relative defenselessness given her stationary nature. Music 2. Mother Brain's music is a low-sounding theme meant to evoke tension, but that kind of thing really doesn't fit a final boss, which should be the climax of tension. It's also like a 10-second loop. It's pretty boring, too short, and unfitting for a final boss. At least they tried something different though. Spectacle 5. There's not much spectacle here, but the increased size compared to the other bosses and the unique music, as dull as it is, do give off the impression of Mother Brain's significance. Her death animation also helps, as the other bosses just blow up normally, whereas Mother Brain's death causes her to violently explode, lighting the whole screen in flashes for several seconds and triggers the destruction of the entire area, forcing you to flee. Reward 7. Your reward for defeating Mother Brain is atypical, as the reward is the escape sequence and subsequent end of the game. The escape, now an iconic element of Metroid, is pretty solid here, forcing the player to utilize their mastery of platforming. The end of the game is a really cool reward, being one of the biggest surprises and most important moments in video game history, revealing that Samus is a woman. It also rewards you by being the end of Nestroid, which can feel very nice after dealing with awful physics and slowdown for an entire playthrough. Total 4.8. The fight could have been a lot better, but the problems that plague Nestroid are at their worst here, and make the fight a slog, and it also isn't helped by the lackluster supplementary material. Its great inner workings help the score, but it's a bad boss fight in execution, so it suffers overall. The top of the rankings for Nestroid is Kraid, and his ratings are: Concept 7. Nestroid's Kraid kind of looks like an upright, carnivorous rhino rather than a reptile like his later looks, which is actually kind of neat. The boss fight itself helps the score, as having multiple ways to approach the fight is novel and adds depth and nuance. Design 8. Kraid's horizontal movement and small stature makes him highly aggressive and forces the player to stay on their toes, while the room, other than the acid pit being too difficult to escape, also works well with the fight by forcing direct engagement with Kraid. Visual design 5. Kraid's sprite work is pretty solid, but his coloration is mostly this ugly beige color rather than the much more fitting green being his primary color. He also doesn't have his most recognizable features, like his 3 eyes, long claws, and large abdominal orifices. The design here services, but Kraid's seen far better. He also doesn't look mean enough. Mechanics 8. The multiple ways to approach the boss fight, along with the plethora of attacks and constant moving Kraid forces out of the player, the mechanics are surprisingly depthful here, though like Mother Brain, it's not particularly interesting or intricate. Gameplay 7. The mechanics and design are really good, and the fight isn't hurt by Nestroid's general problems either, except for slowdown, which can mess up timing. Sound effects 5. The sound effects are the same as the ones used for Ridley and Mother Brain, and they don't really fit Kraid much better than Ridley, so it gets the same score. Music 6. It's just the Turian theme again, and it doesn't really fit Kraid any better or worse than Ridley, so it gets the same score here. Spectacle 5. Kraid's size and presence do nothing for this category, but he is at least built up to thanks to the area, given the monument-like structures on your way to Kraid, including the room just before you fight him, and the music for Kraid's lair is dramatic and high-key, giving his fight a sense of importance and finality. Reward 4. The reward is 75 missiles, just like Ridley. However, odds have it that Kraid will be defeated before Ridley, so getting a reward of 75 missiles is actually worthwhile, whereas if you go through the trouble of fighting Ridley, you probably have enough missiles where it's basically meaningless. It is still possibly the lamest reward in the series, but at least it's an actual reward here. Total 7.8. Not the greatest boss fight the series has to offer, but a pretty great start all things considered. The mechanics and design culminate in a great fight, only slightly hindered by Nestroid's general issues, though the supplementary aspects leave room for improvement. In all, Nestroid's boss fights left a lot of room for improvement, but the groundwork for something much greater was built here. Mostly. Sadly, a lot of what they did in these fights was undone by the game's larger problems, especially Mother Brain's fight, and the technology simply wasn't there to do much with the non-gameplay aspects of the fights. Thankfully, the realizations of their designs would be forged in subsequent entries, but on the first go-around, it could have been a lot better. Of course, if you disagree with my rankings, my ratings, or my reasoning, or if you just have anything on your mind that you'd like to share with me, feel free to do so in the digital reply box down below. Station feedback is always welcome and helps the channel grow and improve with time. That will be all for this broadcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember to play the superior Famicom version if you can, and I'll see you next broadcast.